There's a particular kind of exhaustion that starts to happen when you've been trying for a long time, and life still hasn't become what you thought it would become. And I don't mean dramatic failure. That's actually easier to process sometimes because at least it's obvious. At least you can point to the wreckage and say, there, that's what happened. I mean the quieter kind of disappointment, the kind that accumulates slowly. So slowly, in fact, that you barely notice it happening until one day you realize you don't talk about the future the way you used to. You become careful with hope after a while. People rarely admit that openly, but it's true. After enough plans that didn't work, enough effort that didn't lead where you thought it would lead, something in you starts pulling back emotionally, not completely. You still function. You still go to work, you still answer messages and make jokes, and continue participating in your own life. But inwardly, you stop leaning forward the same way. You stop expecting things with your whole heart, because expectation becomes associated with pain. And I think many people live there for years without realizing it. You can see it in small behaviors. People start sleeping later, because nighttime feels less demanding than daytime. They stop making plans 6 months ahead because imagining the future begins to feel emotionally dangerous. They become quieter around friends because explaining where they are in life starts requiring too much honesty. And honesty is exhausting when you're not even sure you understand your own situation yet. What's strange is that from the outside, none of this necessarily looks serious, which is partly why people feel so alone inside it. There's no visible catastrophe, nothing dramatic enough to justify the weight they're carrying, so they begin minimizing it themselves. They say things like, "I'm just tired," or "I think I'm in a weird phase," when really what they're experiencing is grief. Not grief over one event necessarily, grief over the gap between the life they imagined and the life they actually found themselves living. And that gap can become psychologically brutal if you stay inside it too long. Because human beings need movement. We can survive difficulty remarkably well if we believe it's leading somewhere meaningful. Viktor Frankl wrote about this after surviving the concentration camps. One of the things he observed, and this is important, is that suffering by itself does not necessarily make people stronger. Sometimes suffering simply destroys people. The thing that allowed some individuals to endure unimaginable conditions was not optimism exactly. It was meaning, the belief that their suffering was connected to something larger than immediate pain. And I think modern people underestimate how psychologically necessary meaning actually is. A person can endure an extraordinary amount when they understand why they are enduring it. But when years begin to feel disconnected from purpose, that's when the mind starts turning against itself. That's when people begin asking those dangerous late-night questions. What am I doing? Did I waste my time? Did I go in the wrong direction entirely? Was I naive to believe this mattered? And honestly, those are not irrational questions. I think sometimes self-help culture tries too hard to immediately rescue people from difficult thoughts. But difficult thoughts are often attempts at truth. If someone feels lost, after investing 10 years into something that collapsed, it would be absurd to expect them to simply stay positive. Human beings are not machines. Your nervous system keeps score of disappointment whether you want it to or not. But here's where I think people misunderstand their own lives. We tend to evaluate years only through visible outcomes. Did the relationship survive? Did the business succeed? Did the dream materialize? And if the answer is no, we label the entire chapter a failure. But psychologically speaking, that's an unbelievably shallow way to measure a human life, because experience changes you even when it doesn't reward you immediately. And sometimes the deepest transformations happen during periods that appear externally unproductive. Carl Jung talked about this idea repeatedly, that much of human development happens unconsciously, beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. You often do not understand what a period of your life meant until years after you've already survived it. At the time, it simply feels confusing, or painful, or slow. But later, with enough distance, you realize that an old version of yourself was quietly collapsing while another version was trying to emerge. And that process rarely feels good while it's happening. A lot of people listening to this are probably in that exact place right now, in between identities, no longer fully connected to the person they used to be, but not yet capable of becoming whoever they're turning into. That psychological space is deeply uncomfortable because human beings crave narrative clarity. We want to know where we are in the story. We want reassurance that the suffering means something, but transformation is messy by nature. It confuses you while it's happening. That's why people become nostalgic during hard periods. Not necessarily because the past was better, but because the past at least feels coherent. The past has structure. The future doesn't. So people reread old messages, revisit old music, look at photographs they haven't opened in years. They're trying to reconnect with emotional certainty. They want proof that their life once made sense to them. And sometimes, if we're being honest, they miss versions of themselves they can never fully return to. That's a painful realization. But it's also part of growing older consciously. You begin understanding that life is not simply about gaining things. It's also about losing identities, losing illusions, losing futures you once believed were guaranteed. And maturity, in many ways, is learning how to grieve those losses without allowing them to poison your relationship with existence itself. Because bitterness is always waiting nearby after disappointment. That's the real danger, not failure, bitterness. Failure can teach you something. Failure can reorganize your priorities. Failure can deepen you. But bitterness freezes people psychologically. It turns pain into identity. And once someone becomes identified with disappointment, they stop participating honestly in life because they assume the future will betray them the same way the past did. And you can understand why people become like that. You really can, but you cannot build a meaningful life from that position. At some point, the question has to change. Not, was it worth it? That question keeps you trapped in judgment. The better question is, what did this experience make possible inside me that did not exist before? That is a radically different orientation towards suffering, because maybe the relationship ending forced you to confront your fear of loneliness. Maybe the career failure exposed how much of your identity depended on external validation. Maybe the years that felt directionless were actually stripping away borrowed ambitions that never truly belonged to you in the first place. People rarely consider that possibility seriously enough. Sometimes what feels like life refusing to give you what you wanted is actually life refusing to let you disappear into something too small for your real nature. And I know that sounds philosophical, but I mean it practically. There are people who achieved exactly what they originally wanted and became miserable because the dream itself was immature. It reflected who they were at 20, not who they became at 35. But because they never failed, they never had to re-examine the dream itself. Failure, painful as it is, sometimes forces an encounter with reality that success delays. And reality, genuine reality, is where meaningful life actually begins. So no, I don't think everything happens for a reason. I think that phrase is too simplistic for the complexity of human suffering. Some things are tragic. Some losses remain painful forever. Some years genuinely wound people. But I do think human beings are capable of transforming suffering into wisdom if they remain psychologically honest long enough. That's different. And maybe that's what those years were actually doing. Not ruining you, not wasting your time, forming depth inside you that could not have been developed any other way. Because there's a difference between intelligence and depth. Intelligence can come from books. Depth usually comes from surviving things that forced you to confront yourself. And people who have confronted themselves honestly, they speak differently. They love differently. They carry themselves differently. There's less performance in them. Less arrogance, less certainty about simplistic answers. They become softer in some ways and stronger in others. Not because suffering is beautiful, but because reality, when faced voluntarily, changes people. And maybe that's where you are right now. Not at the end of your life, not even necessarily at the end of your confusion, but at the point where the years begin reorganizing themselves into wisdom instead of regret. And that takes time. More time than people expect. But if you stay honest, if you resist bitterness, if you continue participating in your own life even after disappointment, something strange starts happening. The pain stops being merely pain and becomes understanding. And understanding is never wasted.